Challenges and considerations in LGBTQ research. There are many things that we need to think about when we're doing research in this area, and things that other areas might not need to think about when they're doing their research. So, today we're talking about three different considerations that LGBTQ psychologists might have when they're doing psychological studies. First is the concern or challenge of defining the population. We talked about roughly what does LGBTIQ stand for. However, we didn't really talk about what it was defined as. So we said it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, or questioning, among other things. But what does it mean to be lesbian? What does it mean to be gay? How do we define these different things? Well, the answer varies depending on if you're researchers, if you're a participant, or if you're the literature broadly. How we define these different terms can vary amongst all of these groups. And that makes studying this a bit difficult, because if you, on your study, write down, are you lesbian, gay, bisexual, or heterosexual, you have one meaning that you are thinking in your head. But participants also have their own definition, own meaning. And potentially, that means you'll be including people you might not have wanted to include, or excluding people that you wish you would have included. Related to this is often because of the fuzziness of how we might define who is a lesbian, who is gay, who is someone who is bisexual. We often rely on the participants to self-identify, that we offload this work on them, with the assumption that they can easily and accurately fit themselves into lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, if you even include that, which a lot of studies don't. A lot of studies don't even include lesbian, gay, or bisexual. But we ask them to pick, which one of these do you identify with? And there have been many times when I've gotten comments from participants on the studies I've done that they don't feel like those words describe who they are. They don't feel like they consider themselves a lesbian or a gay man. This results in people not wanting to do your study, as well as potentially missing people that you might want to have included. A second consideration for LGBTQ psychologists is accessing and recruiting samples. So, two things here. First is that compared to other psych studies, it's much harder to conduct random sampling. Now, random sampling and random assignment are these gold standards in a majority of psych studies, where you take from a general pool of people that you know all qualify for your study and randomly pick people out of that pool who will participate, so that you will reduce the possibility of some kind of sampling-related bias. With LGBTQ populations, it's hard enough to get even that pool together, because this makes up a fraction of the population, a substantial fraction, but still, it's hard to get a random sample of people who are LGBTQ. Secondly, there can be considerations that you need to think about when asking people to participate in your study. There are differences in levels of outness, as well as the safety of different participants to participate in your study. For example, there have been studies that have found LGBTQ people living in rural or low socioeconomic areas need to be more careful about their visibility, because if they out themselves, they could face some serious discrimination in their community. Anywhere from getting kicked out of their homes to physical violence. This means that a lot of the studies that you see on LGBTQ populations have to rely on convenience types of samples. So samples that are gathered either in large metropolitan areas, where typically there's less stigma around being LGBTQ, or samples that rely on groups that are LGBTQ centered. So an LGBTQ community center where people go to, an LGBTQ professional organization for people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, who are also like construction workers or things like that. The issue with that is Not everyone who's lesbian or gay or bisexual or pan is a part of those organizations. In fact, there's probably some sampling bias due to people who self select to be in those organizations, leading to bias in many different studies. So it's hard to minimize bias in LGBTQ studies, specifically sampling bias, for these reasons. It's just hard to access and recruit this population in a way that maintains their safety. Now, based on what we can gather from large data, there are roughly this percent of each of these groups in the general population. So based on large survey data, we find that roughly 5 to 7% of the population identifies as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Roughly 0.5 to 1% identifies as transgender, and roughly 0.05% to 1.7% possibly identify as people with intersex variations. Now, this is difficult to say for sure because of all the reasons that we just said. Typically, people are hesitant to respond or answer this question because it can come back and bite them. And also, this question isn't often collected in large survey types of data. So think about the census. Here's a task for you. Look up how long it took to add sexual orientation to the census. What's your guess on when was the first time they collected data on sexual orientation in the census? Go look it up. Last piece, ethical practices. When we're doing studies with LGBTQ populations, a core thing you need to think about is minimizing harm to your participants. This is, not weird for any psychologist. I mean, for all studies, you want to try to minimize harm. For LGBTQ psychologists, this is a much more relevant concern, much more prevalent of a concern, because we're working with marginalized populations where their identities are stigmatized, sometimes in their community. So, first off, we want to think about heterosexist and cisgenderist assumptions in the studies that we do. There have been many studies that look at general principles of human behavior. Maybe it's couples counseling. Maybe it's a study on safe sex. In these studies, a lot of them tend to have an assumption that the people who are doing this are heterosexual, or the people who the study really is referring to are cisgender. And so you might see in like a counseling or like a couples counseling type of study where they make recommendations based on the assumption that there's a woman and a man, or more specifically, a cisgender woman and a cisgender man. And they present their advice to couples counselors based on this assumption. You can imagine it makes it hard then if you're two cisgender gay guys go into a couples counselor and the majority of research is framed for heterosexual people. That's an assumption you gotta watch out for, and an assumption that many people outside of this field need to begin correcting. So secondly, another thing we need to think about here is maintaining anonymity, or in another way of saying this, avoiding outing someone when they participate in our study. Imagine you put a rainbow flyer on a billboard somewhere, on like a post, like a community board somewhere that says, "Are you any of these identities? Please pull off this number here and contact us." Anyone that goes up and pulls off that number is going to kind of out themselves as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, any of the things that you might have included in your study. So, this can be a barrier for participation. And depending on how you recruit participants, manage participants' data, and report these results in any kind of thing that you write up for publication, it could potentially out someone and have a significant negative effect on their life. You can think too of, let's say you're at a school and you're looking for youth that identifies LGBTQ who can participate in your study, but you need parent permission. You probably don't want to email or call the parents and say, hey, your kid wants to participate in a study of like bisexual people, because that's going to out them as being bi. So these ethical practices related to protecting privacy, maintaining anonymity, and avoiding heterosexist assumptions in your studies are really central and core to LGBTQ psychology and other forms of social science.